So yeah, our sponsors, the Warfield Center and the Department for Comparative Literature, and the folks with us here today. It has been a pleasure to bring together a group of folks that are working towards desire in a multitude of ways. We are so excited to bring our conference to a close with our keynote speaker, Dr. Gershon Aviles. Dr. Gershon Aviles is a professor at the University of Maryland with the Department of English. He is also the director of graduate studies, as well as a winner of the William Sanders Scarborough Prize for an astounding scholarly study of Black American literature or culture. Wow. He is the author of Radical Aesthetics and Modern Black Nationalism, which was published in 2016 and won the 2017 William Sanders Scarborough Prize for the Modern Language Association. His second book, Black Queer Freedom, was published in 2020 and was an important inspiration for our conference theme and call for proposals.
Our conceptualizations of our three themes, queerness, temporality, and destabilization, were in part inspired by the work and scholarly conversations of Dr. Gershon Aviles. We've aimed to ground our conversations regarding queerness and destabilization throughout the conference in Dr. Aviles' analysis of spaces of injury and isolation and how disruptive desire redefines these spaces for Black queer folks. His work pushes us to question how the paths to desire invite and demand a destabilization of spaces of injury perpetuated by racial capitalism. Our use of temporality is also deeply tied to this work, this journey. Temporality as a way to think through refusal lets us grieve our queer desires of the past, the present, and the future, and the many ways that these are indistinguishable from one another at this time. We see his work as a vital touchstone for future conversations, and we're grateful for the opportunity to continue thinking through these conversations with him now. Please help us welcome Dr. Gershon Aviles.
Wow, thank you all so much for that incredible introduction. I have to begin by thanking Patricia and Paula for the kind invitation to give the keynote for this conference. It actually means a lot to me to have young scholars like you all engaging my work, and the fact that you would say that it was foundational to what you were thinking about this conference, is incredibly touching. So you all honor me deeply just by the invitation to share some time with you today. Thank you for that. I also want to say I've been really impressed by the parts of the conference that I've gotten to see today, from discussions of wasted love and meditations on home, family, and land in Guyana, to considerations of teacher education and university structural and symbolic commitments to trans students. Like these papers ran the gamut of possibilities, but you all have, through this conference, exemplified what interdisciplinary a conference can be. So thank you for allowing me to see part of that. My talk today is called Queer Bodies in Time, and it comes from a larger project I'm working on about queer history, or the question of queer history. So I'll jump right in so that we can have time, hopefully, for a substantial Q&A afterward. To understand queerness in the 21st century, it is vital to think about time. Many thinkers make sense of queer subjects by exploring their complex relationships to the past, present, and future, as well as what time signifies. Exemplifying the term to think about the past, Heather Love explores the historical impossibility of the queer subject and the recurring emphases on stubborn attachment to the past that she reads as feeling backward. Taking a different tack, Jose Esteban Munoz aligns queerness with the future. As many of you know, he sees it as rejecting the here and now for a time to come. Maintaining the focus on time, but thinking about past and present, Jack Halberstam and Elizabeth Freeman each understands queer time in terms of the rejection of social convention and normativity. To talk about queerness means to come to terms with how queerness disturbs conventional understandings of time. Kara Keeling is more concerned with queer temporality as a result of time's potential to produce risk for certain subjects. Along those lines, our conventional ways of organizing time ignore non-normative ways of thinking because they pose the kind of threat implicit in the ability to disturb. Keeling's primary point is that queerness is endogenous to time, or that ideologies rooted in social control and regulation inform our understanding of time and create a desire for other queer and risky ways of understanding that refuse regulatory power. So it's kind of like the critical landscape I'm mapping out now is the one I'm going to be building on in my talk today. I take seriously this ongoing critical linkage between queerness and temporality, and especially Keeling's formulation. However, I want to think about the flip side of that formulation. Time might be perceived as being endogenous to or growing from within queerness. I consider how queer bodies make us aware of time, whether through temporal refusal, embrace, or displacement. Queerness leads to theorizations of the body in time and exposes our assumptions about temporality. In my talk today, I'll discuss two authors who construct Black queer identity by confronting histories of oppression, undermining the absenting of Black queer presence from the public record, and inquiring about the time of queerness. I argue that novelists Mia McKenzie and Robert Jones Jr. use queer characters to reorient narrative understandings of time and present new relationships to it. By engaging the past and ideas about historical knowledge of Black queerness, they show how temporal consciousness emerges in the context of the non-normative. McKenzie and Jones locate Black queer life in the recent and distant past, and in doing so, they provide meditations on time and the writing of history. They adduce temporal understandings to explain queer bodies and experiences, so that time is presented as a queer formation. I begin the talk with a consideration of the larger historical context of Black queer writing from the end of the 20th century. And from there, I discuss how each of the two novels I talk about show how the writers use writing of the past to suggest not just that there is a history to queerness, but that Black queer life encourages an awareness of the boundaries and limits of temporal understandings. I begin with this question. How and why do we get this temporal thinking about queer characters in the 21st century? The sense of social displacement of queer bodies within the public sphere encourages a questioning of space as well as time. The politicization and embrace of an out Black queer identity in the 1970s and 80s were responses to the radicalization of social movements during the late 20th century, including the Black Power movement, second wave feminism, and advancements in queer organizing. These means of activism each sought to unseat the constricting ideologies that define Cold War era US culture and to argue for social change that would lead to a different lived experience for minoritized individuals. However, many of these movements were plagued ideologically and interpersonally by the kinds of discriminatory logics that define the social realm they were critiquing, as you know. There were often critiques that Black radical organizations relied upon gender hierarchies and heteronormativity. Many Black women felt as if feminism, as articulated by white women, ignored the structural realities of race and the actual experience of women of color. In addition, some Black lesbians expressed concerns that some feminism-aligned Black women were not interested in thinking about non-heterosexual sexual activity. Even though queer people of color played important roles in the history of queer activism as we know it, anti-Black racism has still existed and still exists in many queer spaces. These collective realities that I map out now encourage the feeling that there is little concern about Black queer life and few spaces safe for Black queerness within the public realm. In my 2020 book, Black Queer Freedom, I argue that a concern with space undergirds the experience of Black queerness throughout the diaspora, precisely because of the multivalent threat that surrounds this subject. This sense of threat makes one feel as if they are out of place or have no space in the social world. However, this sense of being out of place is accompanied by the feeling of being out of time in the cultural imagination. Many Black gay and lesbian writers who document queer existence think about this question of time and use a consciousness about temporality to kind of frame their work. Anne Allen Shockley's novel, Loving Her, Audre Lorde's biomythography, Zami, Marlon Riggs' film, Tongues Untied, Jewel Gomez's novel, The Gilda Stories, Samuel Delaney's novel, The Madman, Cheryl Dunye's film, Watermelon Woman, and Robert O'Hara's play, Insurrection Holding History, All these texts from different moments in time are all deeply concerned with the question of how the past gets written, and they all explore how we place the Black queer figure in time. Many more recent literary texts or treatments of Black queer life use queer figures to upset conceptions of time in their narrative worlds, and I turn to those today. The necessity of confronting the past as it relates to Black queer life is made explicit in Mia McKenzie's 2012 novel, The Summer We Got Free. McKenzie is the creator of the website Black Girl Dangerous, which showcases the voices of queer and trans people of color. In The Summer We Got Free, McKenzie disarms the past through acts of interrogation. She uses questions and revelations to make her characters come to terms with traumatizing events and dysfunctional relationships. Her primary queer character becomes a conduit to temporal change. The novel is set in West Philadelphia home of the Delaney family, and this includes Father George, Mother Regina, daughter Sarah, daughter Ava, and Ava's husband, Paul. The primary action takes place in 1976 when Paul's estranged sister, Helena, shows up for a visit, and everyone's lives are disordered by revelations regarding the past. These revelations are secrets, primarily secrets about sexuality, and the showing of or sharing of these secrets drive the narrative action. The Summer We Got Free depicts being haunted by the past. In fact, if you read the novel, several ghosts show up over the course of the novel. And the family members also effectively live in a haunted house. They live in the shadow of the traumatic loss of their son, Gio, who was killed years before alongside a neighborhood boy, Kenny. The ghosts that appear represent subjugated knowledge, information that is hidden from view, and also willed silences. McKenzie constitutes her characters through situations of temporal alienation, meaning that they feel estranged from the past and confined in their present. Ava, the daughter, blames herself for her brother's death, Gio's death, and this emotional burden emerges as a lack of emotional connection to her husband. She married him because he was there, basically. She has no emotional connection to him. Sarah, the other sister, feels overwhelmed by her siblings, Gio because of his absence, Ava because of her overwhelming presence. Gio's death gets connected to the onset of the mother's mental instability and her general disconnection from the outside world. The father, George, is a character governed by secrecy. He refuses to talk about the past and generally avoids his family so that he will not have to have any serious conversations. So that the house ultimately is full of silences and discomfort because of the experiences in the neighborhood during and after Gio's murder. The family members are all stuck spatially and temporally. The characters all want to keep the past at bay, and they appear locked in an unmoving, unchanging present. The only out queer character, Helena, becomes a narrative device that sheds light on and undermines this temporal alienation. Peppering the Delaneys with questions to learn about her brother Paul's new family, Helena is a figure who asks questions about the past, thus making it present for the other characters. These questions disrupt the normal patterns of behavior for the Delaneys, taking people out of their rhythms and upsetting the seeming affective paralysis stifling the family. She encourages a different relationship to time in the Delaney household by making them aware that they're stuck. The household dynamics have been built upon silences, as I said, but these silences are primarily about queer desires and actions. Much of the narrative tension in the domestic space surrounds same-sex desire and the expression of queer identity. The father, George, is closeted and has been having secret trysts with men for years. Helena, the visitor, has recently been fired for having an affair with the mother of one of her pupils. Ava's sexual desire is stoked by Helena's presence, and Helena helps Ava to remember a same-sex kiss that she had as a young person. Ava's husband, Paul, went to juvenile detention for accidentally killing a young woman whom he believed to be sexually violating his sister, Helena, only until they learned that the actions were consensual. So that, as you can probably hear, it's as if all of the narrative and all of the characters' sense of frustrations are rooted in anxieties around and histories of same-sex desire. McKenzie uses this out-queer character, Helena, to dislodge the secrecy-related temporal alienation. The experiences of the Delaney's family show how queerness gets aligned with a destructive past. In contrast to this understanding, Mackenzie presents Helena as a conduit for revelation. She doesn't just reveal secrets, she reveals new ways for the family to relate to each other and to time. This queer character then becomes a figure of time, or one that makes new temporal experiences possible. It is important that the past emerges through an out queer figure. This narrative use of Helena resonates with Elizabeth Freeman's contention that the queer figure can be a figure for history, a figure for history. Freeman explains how those seen as sexual deviants often get connected to notions of moralistic end of times, or they get imagined as breaking away from how we understand life now. They don't fit in time. This historicity of queerness is constant with Munoz's idea of queer futurity to some extent, though with a less of a link to utopia. Helena is disruptive in the way that Freeman and Halberstam imagine the queer subject can be. She's less a figure of what is to come, good or bad, than a conduit for the past. She is a figure of history insofar as the queer character becomes the means to accessing and moving beyond the past. I also want to just point out the narrative construction, because I think it relates to my thinking about Helena as a figure of history. So the novel is divided up into chapters headed by particular years: 1976, 1950, 1959, 1953, 1955, 1956, and 1983. So those are the major chapters in the book. However, most of the narrative action is dedicated to two specific years: 59 and 76, and especially 76, which is the present of the novel, for most of the novel. The summer of 59 is the interval in which Geo and Kenny are murdered. Like, that moment is when it happens. And the summer of 76 is defined as the moment when Helena arrives at the Delaney's doorstep. 59 and 76 are juxtaposed by being returned to most often. And 76 talks back to 59. The chronologically later summer does not undo the violence of the first when Geo is murdered. Instead, the questions that Helena asks in 1976 and the intimacy she develops with Ava exorcises the past from the Delaney's household, freeing much of the family from their emotional immobility, especially Ava. If when Geo is murdered in 59, if time stops then for the members of the household, it begins to move again in 1976. And it's queer intimacy that is the driver for this temporal shift, this temporal movement. Why else, you might also wonder, just as a reader of the novel, why those particular years might matter, 59 and 76. Mackenzie signals through these historical evocations the reality of change over time in regard to Black and queer activism. Although this domestic drama is not about activism, it has as its foundation an exploration of historical change for racial and sexual minorities. The year 1959 situates the reader in a moment after Brown versus Board of Education decision, when it becomes clear that the phrase "all deliberate speed" in Brown 2 would mean that desegregation efforts would be stalled. That year is also 5 years before the monumental Civil Rights Act would be passed, while there was ongoing conversation about the need for legislation. Still thinking about 59, although the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare are no longer at their height, there is still an intensified social anxiety about homosexuals as threats to the nation and to families because of Cold War era ideologies. The decade of the 50s represents a time of restriction in many ways for minoritized populations, even as people did find ways to dodge that threat. Geo and Kenny's deaths in 1959 epitomize misdirected violence, as the likely target of the violence in their deaths was actually Ava. But their deaths also signify the kinds of constraints around minoritized bodies, especially in public. Mackenzie purposely skips over the 1960s in writing about the life of this family to suggest how time has stopped for them. 59 and 76 sit next to each other for the family members. It's as if you move from 59 to 76. And skipping over the 60s to concentrate on 76, Mackenzie situates the reader in a period after the Stonewall Uprising, which was a historical inflection point in queer organizing. The second year, 76, is also a moment in which there's been a shift from civil rights political strategies to Black power political strategies alongside a growth in and transformation of the feminist movement. Even though Helena in the novel proclaims that feminist movement was not thinking about Black women, the novel makes us think about shifts in those ideologies. If the 1950s came to be defined by constraint, the 1970s promised change and possibilities. I read the contrapuntal nature of the narrative through this structural and conceptual juxtaposition, which is embodied through the inquiring character that is Helena. Again, she moves the family from 59 to 76. As the characters answer Helena's questions, they understand the past better and redefine their relationship to it. Helena offers freedom through reckoning with traumatic history. However, Mackenzie is reluctant to provide a happy ending. Some of the characters are still stuck. They don't all kind of move forward in time or deal with their anxieties around same-sex desire. The freedom mentioned in the title is a freedom from being controlled by the past. It is not a freedom from time, but a new awareness of their situatedness in a temporal moment that is distinctly not the past. Through queerness, a new relationship to history is possible for those characters who choose to embrace it. I now turn briefly to Robert Jones's 2021 debut novel, The Prophets, to explore how contemporary writers shape the Black queer subject through temporal strategies and use queer characters as strategies for theorizing time. The Prophets, and some of you might have read it, is set on a plantation the Black enslaved laborers call empty. They call it empty. The chapters shift narrative focus to different individuals living on empty, but most of the narrative action revolves around the lives of Samuel and Isaiah. Referred to as the two of them, Samuel and Isaiah are a couple who live and work together. It is not their story solely, but they and their romance lie at the heart of the narrative action and the violent climax toward which the narrative builds. The novel is set much further back in time than Mackenzie's novel, but like Mackenzie, Jones uses queer figures and desire as a way to disrupt social understandings and as conduits to the past. That being said, there are two important distinctions. Mackenzie offers a Black queer character as a disruptive figure of time. Moving in a different direction, Jones uses his queer characters to theorize queer temporality and rethink history through the framework of non-normative desire. Jones performs this queer temporality as an oppositional gesture toward both the racial oppression and heteronormative practices of enslavement. That being said, his queer figures still reorient a narrative sense of time. Part of the value of this text is that it actively imagines the lives of Black figures with same-sex desire in the antebellum period. Everyone in the novel knows that Isaiah and Samuel are together, but few feel the need to explain or feel as if they have adequate language for their intimacy. To quote from the novel, "There was no word extraordinary enough, particularly in the tongue she now spoke," explains Maggie, who works in the kitchen. When a few people grow uncomfortable because of the rise in conservative religious sentiment among some of the plantation, Adam, the plantation chauffeur, cannot understand all the fuss. He questions, "So what if in the silent dark they entwined? What difference did that make? Don't people got to do what they got to do to make it another day? You can't expect all this work to get done and misery be the only massa to oversee it." And he goes on to say he thinks they have a right to a reprieve in each other. Implicit in Adam's comments is a significance for intimacy and self-determination in the context of the totalizing institution of enslavement. The exact nature of this salvific intimacy is all but immaterial here. There is a widespread feeling that there is something special or unique about this relationship between these two men. A significant component of the queerness of their relationship is the fact that they choose to be together, which undermines the temporal logic of the plantation. Isaiah insists to Samuel, "To you I freely come." It is common practice for the landowner Paul to pair men and women together for sex to increase the enslaved population. Basically, he breeds them proactively. Jones uses this narrative element to remind us of the biopolitical nature of enslavement. There is not a feeling of any couple getting to come together freely except for Isaiah and Samuel. Their same-sex desire contributes to our reading of them as queer, but within the social logic of empty and US enslavement in general, this idea of choice and freedom in a romantic relationship also has an element of non-normativity to it. Their refusal to procreate marks them as a problem because it endangers the cycle of production that drives the life on the plantation. It also makes their queerness a social threat from the standpoint of their enslaver because time is understood in terms of the procreative cycle, which is connected to the harvest cycle that defines the temporal logic on empty. Their relationship reveals and upsets time. Although the representations in the novel suggest that Jones is interested in recovering the possibility of same-sex desire before the 20th century and exposing the biopolitical arrangement of enslavement, what's most interesting about this depiction of Isaiah and Samuel, and the reason I'm talking about it today, is the sense that there's a temporal non-belonging to their experiences. Near the end of the novel, Isaiah wonders, what if he and Samuel would have been, if they hadn't have come of age in chains? They are of their moment, subject in time, but they are highly aware of the constraints in which they must exist, the limitations of their own historical period. Thus, okay, just seeing that. I saw a note in the chat, sorry. Thus, they feel alienated from their time. The passage suggests an awareness of or desire for other spatial and temporal possibilities. Isaiah hypothesizes an otherwise, and he asks questions about their place in time. And I want to attend closely to the language Isaiah uses. In having the character contemplate his own non-normative desire and relationship, Jones has the character's moment of wondering combine the past perfect tense with the conditional mood. Could have been, would have been. The tense refers one to a time earlier than before now, and the mood registers an event whose realization is dependent upon another condition. It is an example of the conditional perfect, which in English is used to convey the hypothetical, the counterfactual, and the contingent. Isaiah's lived reality feels connected to the counterfactual. Only through the temporal framework of verbal tense and mood can Jones convey the limits placed on queerness. Isaiah's statements reveal the temporal uncertainty of queer intimacy. The linking of temporal possibility and temporal loss results in the imagining of novel understandings of placement and time through these two queer characters. The latter, Samuel, expresses a reluctance about the past. He says, "The past had no use other than to dredge up pain and mystery and thus to confound. And there were already too many things in the present that made no damn sense. So the future was the only place where he might find resolution." Through this statement made out of desperation, Jones links queer positionality with a longing for the future. However, as the narrative progresses, Jones complicates this desire. Later, the character Maggie goes further when she declares to Samuel, "You in this place, but you ain't of it. You hear what I'm telling you? Neither you or Isaiah, and neither one of you belong here in this place. What I'm saying is there be a whole better place for you. Maybe not somewhere, but sometime." Maggie declares that the two of them are subjects out of time. Her point is not just a call for the possibilities for future, it is a call for a different understanding of time. And it is the Isaiah-Samuel relationship that necessitates this alternative temporality. Although there's spatial separation, they live in the barn, the fact that everybody knows they live apart draws attention to their intimacy. It is their temporal placement that is a defining sign of their queerness and leads to Maggie's insistence on a different way of imagining their place in time. And I'm going to move to close now. This is the last little part. The sense of queer temporal isolation, of not belonging in their historical moment, becomes the basis for retributive justice and revolt on empty. Near the end, Samuel decides that if their fate was to be found in two piles of dust that would be swept up and scattered, then damn it, let there be a storm beforehand. Let the blood run down. At least they would have known what it was like to be with each other. He understands that their non-belonging will cost them their lives. So he decides that he will go down with the fight. Samuel comes to this realization about the need for a metaphorical storm that will be realized in bloodshed as he's being sexually assaulted by Timothy, the slave master's son. Timothy has found out that Isaiah and Samuel have a sexual relationship and decided that he will take their bodies and intimacy for himself. He keeps insisting that he is different from his father because of his views, his seemingly positive views on Black people, but his sexual violation of Isaiah and Samuel mirrors his father's treatment of Black women. Earlier, Timothy had forced Isaiah to sleep with him and has now called for Samuel. His pretense is to paint them. His plan is to fuck them. He asserts to Isaiah, together we can be set free. He means that sexual congress between slaveholder and the enslaved is actually a step toward freedom for everyone, a movement forward in time. Timothy's lecherous proclamation is an insult to freedom, as the men come to his room because they cannot disobey him without punishment. His statement about equality rests upon maintaining power over the men he forces into sex. He argues that interracial queer intimacy will free them from the confining old ways of thinking, but it locks them precisely into a narrative of white empowerment and pleasure through the erasure of Black subjectivity and choice. It is in this forced sex that Samuel makes his realizations about the storm. He kills Timothy. The murder represents the literal destruction of the line because Timothy is the only heir to the plantation. This action also stops the cycle of sexual violence that he and Isaiah were about to get stuck in. Samuel's rejection of the now, his interest in the future, and Timothy's imagined interracial sexual future becomes a rejection and destruction of their where, the empty plantation. Arguably, Isaiah and Samuel are the prophets referred to in the title of the novel, further situating them as figures of time. A prophet is most often understood as being a conduit or interpreter of God's will, and colloquially as someone who can make predictions about the future. Jones does not attempt to connect these characters to divine will. Rather, he positions them as figures of revelation, just as Mackenzie does with Helena. What is revealed is not simply that time may bind us, but that queerness itself can provide ways of thinking that produce alternative relations to time, a sometime distinct from our own. The narrative construction of queerness in these novels results in the atomization and reorganization of familiar notions of time. In the hands of these authors, queerness calls for a domain beyond time's restrictive ideologies, and the crafted space of the narrative is that domain. The Summer We Got Free and the Prophets enhance critical understandings by positing that the queer body emanates temporal frameworks and formations, as opposed to simply being subject to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aviles. We will transition to the Q&A portion of the keynote right now. That was really amazing. Thank you so much for being our keynote. So we here have Silvana Scott and Shukri Bana, who will be helping us with the keynote. They have engaged with your work. They're present for the keynote. Super excited to talk to you today. I want to remind folks to add their questions to the Q&A section of the bottom part of the screen. You can also stick it in the chat if that's easier. And then for folks who are joining us here in person in the room, there are some chairs right here that you can come and sit on if you want to be next in asking your question. Thank you so much. If we could give Dr. Aviles another round of applause.
Hello, I'm Shukri. We just wanted to thank you again for your time and for such an incredible presentation. The question around how queer bodies make us aware of time is one that's going to stick with me for a long time. So my question, inspired by your presentation today and inspired by your book, In Black Queer Freedom, you write, quote, "The desirous freedom is not a panacea that solves all problems, nor is it necessarily long lasting. Nevertheless, it offers moments of satisfaction, control, and autonomy. Sometimes a simple kiss can make one feel freed for a moment." And today in your talk, in the different examples that you were discussing, freedom was also freedom from the past. Freedom was also freedom to be in the future. So if you're able, I would really love to hear more about, these very definitions of freedom, how they work together, and even a consideration of how your definitions of freedom in this project have shifted since your last project.
Thank you so much for that great question. And thank you for quoting from the book. That's lovely to hear you thinking about the book. So thank you for that. I'll answer the question in two ways. No, I guess, as you can probably hear from the presentation today and from my most recent book, I am interested in the question of freedom and what freedom means. But I'm also interested in trying to push us to think about freedom differently. Like one way of thinking about freedom, of course, has to do with political realities, civic engagement, and civic possibilities. And I think it is vital that we do think about the political elements of freedom. So access to voting, access to the social world, things like that. That's really important. However, a lot of my work is suggesting that we don't want to only think about freedom in a political framework. Right. There's a way in which, if you do, and this part of what I say in Black Queer Freedom is, if we actually expect to get freedom from the state to give us freedom, we'll always be disappointed, right? The state is always going to let you down. And if your only framework for thinking about freedom is with kind of political freedoms or citizenship, you can make progress, but you might never be satisfied. So I want to kind of push us to think more capaciously about what freedom can mean. But I also, along those lines, want to think about the freedom of the kind of freedom we get from pleasure, right? That everyday pleasure can give us something, even if it's not long lasting, as the quotation you talked about, even if something is short-lived, even if it doesn't last forever, that could be fulfilling in a way, and is important. We can't only think about freedom as this project in the future, then when we get there and we'll be done with it, we can't think about that. We've got to think about that it's a process, and that we might find my freedom might not look like your freedom, or what counts as freedom. So I think that this question of, not just a question, but a larger project of mine is thinking about what freedom can look like, and turning to artists and artists' work to help us understand that differently, so that we don't only have like one idea. Like freedom means we actually have the right to vote. Like that is a freedom, but for me as a thinker, that cannot be the only thing we count about freedom, especially because I also don't ever want to lose sight of the value of pleasure. I just think that's really important. And for me, pleasure and freedom go together, and that can look differently. So I think that's how I'd answer your question. Oh, no, your last part was has it changed from the second book, my sense of what freedom means? I guess the answer is no. I'm still thinking of those terms. I'm still committed to, in some ways, what I do in the second book. I'm still thinking about some of those questions in the new work I'm doing, but trying to take it in different directions. So I'm still there. In this project, which is much more about time, I think I'm just trying to think about how to make us rethink what time looks like, right? And what the experience of time is, and just drawing attention to it. So I guess that it's not quite along the exact same lines, except part of the freedom is the scale of freedom I'm interested in, and maybe also the scale of time. So I think I'll answer your question that way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thinking about freedom as a process, and thinking about all of the multiplicities of it, and how those multiplicities might look in different temporalities is incredibly generous and capacious. I want to just invite anyone who's in the room as well who wants to come up and ask a question, so we're not hogging this Q&A.
We also have another question prepared, but yeah.
Hello, Dr. Aviles.
Hello.
My name is Michael Cordova. I've come with a question for you about time.
Okay.
So I'm thinking a lot on this discussion, and I've kind of came to starting to think again with Michel Roth-Trio in Silencing the Past. And he has this claim. He says basically how the past itself is a place in geotemporal mapping. And so that was sort of the thing that I'm like, oh, the past is a place, and you're talking about the past as a place of temporal alienation. So when we frame this proposition in your conversation on the past as in part serving as a master script that stabilizes, calcifies, and forces Black queer existences, not all the time, but in those sort of structural ways, and forces them into a stasis, on what terms can the past be engaged in the relational or queer presence that undoes temporal alienation as you presented? What sort of strategies do we have to engage with here?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'll 1 second. I have a couple of ways I want to answer that question. Space, and then onward. Okay, so I'm gonna offer like 3 ways into answering your question. And the first is not an answer, but it's a response, and it's to say, what I love about your question is you're bringing to the surface a point that's kind of more implicit in my talk, but the extent to which for me, it's very difficult to fully separate questions of temporality from questions of space. Like spatial temporality is kind of there I'm always, even though this project in my mind, I'm thinking about time, I can't escape from space. And as you said, quoting that the past is a place, so that the moment that we're talking about time, we are often conjuring spatial understandings as well. So I just appreciate that your question brought that to the surface. So thank you for that. The second thing is, and I love this question because it's how might we then approach that past? And much of my work, particularly in Black queer freedom, that my argument answer to that question is turning to creative expression and cultural production is one way to approach that past, which might seem itself counterfactual, because an answer could be thinking about the archive. But I think I am, like many critics, particularly cultural historians, very suspicious of what it is we call the archive, and thinking about Saidiya Hartman's work and how the limits of the archive and how fabulation becomes one way to address the limitations of it. And so, but I think, so my answer is actually thinking very seriously about how creative expression, by that I mean literature, I mean performance, I mean community get-togethers, like thinking about how cultural production and studying that actually might help us approach the past, when the past itself and history with the capital H is always going to be so contentious. And there's a way in which, in a way, this maybe goes back to my earlier answer, history, much like the state, is always going to disappoint us. I think there are always going to be voices absent from it if we actually depend too heavily on the record. And I think the work to really build out the record and find those missing voices is vital, but I also think you're always going to hit those blocks, those absences. And so that's why part of what I've done professionally is turn to creative expression to help us capture an understanding of the past, whether or not we can actually get to the past, but we can maybe gain a deeper understanding of it. The third thing I wanted to say is really what your question really is a provocation for us to always be thinking about, or driving ourselves to have multiple ways of approaching the past. Like that that's pretty much, for me, the foundation of your question is the assumption that there cannot just be one way. Right? Because the past is so convoluted, because it's so problematic, or our ways of accessing it that means we need to have multiple approaches to it to even kind of get close to it. So those are the 3 different ways I would approach answering your a very sophisticated question. It's actually a really hard question, but that's how I would start to answer it.
No, yeah, and as you were talking, I kind of thought about, Toni Morrison's remembering that she offers in Beloved. And then I also started thinking about Lamar Jarrell Bruce's new book on how to go mad without losing your mind. And he talks about Black radical creativity and how essential it is if we're going to read the archive, if we're going to engage with silences. And just like you offered, fabulation is a means towards doing so in relational terms rather than doing so in the normative imaginings that the archive offers us. And so it's very generous. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add is partly what you're saying too is we have to, and part of what I'm trying to do in some small way in my work is offer up methodologies that allow us to talk about the past, knowing that there's this insufficiency that's going to be there. So I think in part, really, to answer your question is thinking about different methodologies that do that, and that's really what you're naming Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much for the question.
No problem.
I'll just say, I just appreciate that you all, of course, you've done 2 days of the conference, but I appreciate that you are attending an event, whether in person or virtually, on a Friday afternoon. So I'm really impressed with, with you all.
Yes, and you're here with us, so we are also very impressed.
While other people come up to ask questions, we can ask one in the meantime. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Aviles. One of my questions is regarding your latest book. So giving the special emphasis of your work in regards to Black queer people move through space, I was particularly engaged with your ideas about acts of interruption that function through institutions. Since the ways injuries experienced varies amongst one's positionality, how can we strive towards a form of queer contingency as educators in the academy? How do we navigate classrooms with students who are, quote, injury bound in relationship to our position of authority? Or more broadly, how do you take your ideas of contingency within the artists you theorize with as a professor of both undergraduate and graduate students?
Okay, wow, that's an amazing question. It's certainly a 2-part question. The first, how do I think about, I take the first part of the question to be, how do I think of, how might I apply my ideas about the dangers of institutions to queer folks, and think about it in terms of the university. And then the second question, I forgot the second part of the question.
Yes, or more broadly, how do you take your ideas of
teaching? Yes.
Yes.
So the reason this question is so important is, of course, we're all connected to universities, but there's a Phantom 5th chapter of Black Queer Freedom that was going to be about schools. That was going to be, but then I just finished the book and kept it moving. So I was actually very interested in thinking about schools, because it's an institution that particularly, I mean, outside of, I write about prisons and hospitals settings in the book, but schools are also an important institutional site that for queer formation and for kind of negative queer sentiment. So I think it actually is an important question. And how can we think about that? Actually, I'm thinking about, I'm thinking about the early presentation today on teacher education. And I actually think giving teachers, continuing, I'll say, to give teachers language around the kinds of vulnerabilities students face in their real reality situations could actually be helpful. And so that's the first thing. Understanding that no student population, no classroom is there ever a homogeneous population. There's every single classroom I've ever been in as a student, as a teacher, is very kind of mixed, meaning people are different kind of experiences in terms of their learning and have different situations at home. So understanding that there is never just one student that's perfect. And I think that idea gets to the point of my book that part of when I talk about treatment in Black Queer Freedom a lot, and the challenge is the treatment often ignores individuality. It's like they're treating a subject, right? We're treated, oftentimes still in some of the hospitals, we're treated as subjects, not as individuals. And I think that can also happen, unfortunately, in the classroom setting, where students are experienced as just a student, not an individual. So I actually think trying to think about a model of education that prioritizes not just students, but kind of individual difference is one way to start doing that. And also just, and it's hard because I don't want to make it seem as I'm being overly critical of teachers, because a lot of teachers are just like people who work at hospitals are constrained by the bureaucracy of the institution. In fact, that's what I'm actually most concerned with, I think, is the bureaucracy of institutions. And the bureaucracy of institutions, the fact that you have these layers of people in charge and different rules and regulations, often not only they constrain people who work there, but they become the conduits for the negative queer sentiment, the racism, like whether they mean to or not, because they're not treated as individuals. So I'm getting way off topic. I'll pause there and get to the second part about what it means for maybe what I do in the classroom. I think that's
yes.
You're gonna say, okay, that's great. Part of it, I think, has to do, I think part of it is content, like thinking about what we teach in classes. But I actually think part of it has to do with pedagogical practices. So and here's an example. It's really important for me. Ultimately, I'm an English teacher. Like I care about students being good writers. That's very important to me. So in my classes, they're going to write papers. However, even though I'm teaching English classes primarily, I do understand that writing an 8-page paper might not be the peak skill of every student in that class. So what's really important for me is always to give assignment choices so that students I want people to write papers, but I also want them to figure out what it is they want to do to show that what they've learned over the course of the semester. So almost every class I teach, especially any class it's every class. I think I always try to give students an option to showcase their learning or their skills. That's not just about write me an 8-page paper. So, and they decide, and what I have students do, students have done performances in class, they've done all kinds of digital projects. And I think this is like a very, very small thing, but what I want to suggest is not that there's like a direct line between that particular pedagogical choice and my book, but I do think it does resonate with my interest in thinking, getting beyond understanding people as kind of faceless subjects, right? And that's really what in some ways at the heart of it, the book is about, the dangers in terms of people's experience in prisons, people's experience in hospitals, not being seen in their individuality and what that might mean for them. So that's one way I would answer that question. But I think that is all of us, you're all teachers are planning to do some teaching, is something that I think we have to challenge ourselves with every day. Every day we go in the classroom, not even just at the beginning of the semester, every day, making sure that we are being attentive to student needs and thinking about how to revamp our practices, our assignments constantly, to be thinking about trying to make sure that every student can shine. So that's to be my kind of like teacherly answer. And then the scholarly answer is really just about trying to recognize how institutions are dangerous because of they're over bureaucratized, but also the inability to see individuals, and that perpetuates these problems I point out in the book. So that's how I'd answer it. This is a really good question. I actually want to think more about it. So I thank you. I appreciate you provoking me to think about how I'd answer that question.
No, thank you, Dr. Aviles. That was a very thoughtful response. And as an educator, I'm always thinking about different mediums, and also just in general, like every class we're like thought that our syllabuses should be recycled, or like every class is always going to be different. So how are you actually engaging with those students that are here in the fall and the spring and the next year? Like it's going to be a different class because it is going to be different students, plural. So
and the other thing is that I also try to, and this doesn't always work, but I actually try to leave room in the syllabus. So I let students, let them add things to the syllabus that we read together, so that there's something they find relevant, whether that is like, a music video, some kind of clip online, a poem or book, but so that I want them to see themselves as creators of the syllabus, thinking about what you're saying. And I think that, so that it's not just kind of like the same syllabus I teach every semester, like every semester, ideally the syllabus is particular to that set of students and their interests and their needs, and that, so that I feel like it gives them a way to become invested differently in the class, like they're co-creating it to some extent.
Thank you, Dr. Aviles. We have maybe time for one short question, or there's somebody in the chat, in the Q&A chat. So Holly is asking, is there room for collectivity within the focus of individuality and freedom in this context?
That's a great question. And I would say, I guess my answer has to be yes, but I want to think of a smarter way to answer your question. Is there room for collectivity? So I think the way I answer the question is thinking back to my book, Black for Freedom. I think I both recognize a collective, because people who share similar experiences, but also want to encourage the possibility of collaborative thinking across all my work. So I think there is, but I think the question is hard, because I think you point to attention across, I think, both of my books, is that I think I'm always trying to point out the difficulty of collective action, that it is, because we're individuals, it can be difficult, but I remain invested in its possibility. Here's an example. In my first book, I talk a lot about the challenge of kinship, and how kinship, it's imagined as being this thing that we can actually connect ourselves through. But kinship can also be disappointing, and kinship, like feeling connected to someone because of a racial identity or sexual identity, on the face of things could be a means of connection, but it could also not. It could also fail. Kinship can fail. And so part of what I talk about in the chapter in the first book is thinking about how our someone being Black, this because I'm talking about Blackness in that chapter, like someone being Black, you might assume could be a colleague or a comrade, but that for, a lot of reasons that could not work out. And moving away from that kind of thinking to more thinking about how positionality itself could be a means of collectivity and connection. And in some ways, that idea, moving from identity to positionality, and that doesn't always work either, but that could be one way to form collectivity. And even when I'm talking about Black queerness in my second book, I'm actually talking about queerness as a positionality, meaning that how someone experiences the world, how someone's body gets read, like that becomes how they are able to move through the world. And I think that even though I am emphasizing in my comments before and now, a focus on individual expression, individual possibility, I'm never talking about the individual out of context, because the reality is we all live in the social context, and we are all read and our bodies get interpolated. And no matter how we define ourselves, we all have to navigate how the world sees us. So there's a way in which I never want to lose sight of the individual, but I also never want to ignore that reality, like that no matter how I define myself, the world sees me in certain ways, reads my body in certain ways, and reacts to me in certain ways. And whether I like it or not, I have to deal with that. But understanding how my body gets read and how I have to deal with those realities, understanding other people might have to deal with those same realities, regardless of how they identify, that recognition of positionality can become a means of collective action. I guess that's how I'd answer that question, right? Because I would never want to emphasize identity to the point of like how I identify and ignore these other realities, to ignore that the state, the world sees me in certain ways, is going to make assumptions about me. And that's just the way it is for all of us, all of our bodies. And so, but recognizing how perhaps there's a way in which maybe I get read the way you get read, or that possibility we could connect over that, even if we don't identify in the exact same way. So that's how I would answer your respond to your question. But I deeply appreciate pointing to that tension between the individual and the collective, because I am interested in literature and social justice, that idea of collectivity is always tantalizingly right there. But I'm both trying to recognize its importance, but also recognize how sometimes it is out of reach for different reasons.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aviles, for being here with us today and for your work that has inspired so much of what has gone on these last 2 days of this conference. I'm going to hand it back over to the conference coordinators.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. To say what's happening. I'm going to put my email address in the chat. If anyone has any question they didn't get to ask, or they just want to make a comment or critique of anything I said, please feel free to do so. I'll definitely respond to any comments I get. And I'm sad that I can't be with you and chat after the talk. So please do, if you have any questions, comments, or whatever, feel free to shoot me an email.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aviles. Yes, we have a lovely reception set up after. It would be great if you could come and mingle. This has been so generative. Thank you so much for being with us. I think one final round of applause.
Well, no, I'm truly honored to do this. The fact that you would even ask me and talk about my work I'm near tears, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your spring break.
Enjoy the reception. I'll enjoy my spring break, and have a good rest of your semester.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.